of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Excuse me. Linda Heisman Powell,
Present.
David Stevens,
Here.
Abby Callis. I do not see her on. Mark Goodman,
Here.
Matthew Golker,
Present.
Jessica Hamilton,
Here.
Edward Hunter will not be here this evening. Tiffany Johnson,
Here.
Sarah Kirk,
Here.
Christopher Leonard,
Here.
Jay Middleton,
Here.
and Doug Wright.
Here.
And I also note that the following staff members are present: David Fine.
Here.
And Leslie Allen will not be here this evening. I'll have David Fye read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Richard. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concern, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. 15 minutes has been approved for public comment by representative of the Kansas Psychological Association concerning the required postdoctoral year for psychologist applicants. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other electronic media, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While this meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On October 14th, 2024, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice on that website. An agenda and other meeting material were posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by sending an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And Richard, I did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone beep over and announce themselves, I will let you know.
Thank you, David. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda, and that is the approval of said agenda. Are there any questions or discussion regarding that? I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Matt Golker moves. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by a couple of people. I think I heard Linda and Jessica. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. So the agenda is approved, and that leads us to the next item, which is public comment from Dr. Jason Malasek. He is the president of the Kansas Psychological Association. It is good to see you again, Jason. And as stated earlier, if you could limit your presentation to about 15 minutes, that would be fantastic. And we'll also have some time to discuss what comes up, and if there are any questions, you can field questions thereafter or during your presentation if you would like.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jason Miloshek. I'm the representative of KPA as the current president, also current FAC and council representative. Tonight, thank you for having me. I wanted to talk about amending the training experience requirement of 18 hours be required to be a postdoc experience. APA has created a model licensure act that started in 1955. It's been updated in 1967, 1987, 2010, and there's another update coming as well. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because in 1987, they recognized that the training experiences has changed dramatically in the amount of hours that students were obtaining pre-internship. And so they made some changes where they allowed a little bit more room, a little bit more broad of what they would allow as training experiences, the hours counting towards licensure. And so what they did in that language was not require, telling states that they recommend not requiring a postdoc year and allowing that postdoc year to be the targeted experience. So if you want a more targeted training experience, you could do that. Neuropsych has 2 years postdoc. That's an example of a training experience that would target expertise instead of creating another barrier to licensure for students who at the end of internship and at graduation had already acquired now anywhere between, well, if you have 1,800 to 2,000 hours of internship, they're saying practicum hours were sitting around the 1,500 to 1,800 hour experience, which is a lot different than when they created their first Model Licensure Act. Now, the reason why, other reasons why they did this is because of the financial issues that psychologists, students are subject to. Internship, we know internship stipends have not changed over the last 10, 15 years. They still sit around the $20,000 to $30,000 a year, full-time employment. And then the postdoc year is sitting sometimes double that, but definitely less than what a full-time or a fully licensed psychologist receives after postdoc. So we're talking about another 12 months of training and then another maybe 90 days where they're not licensed. So it's a huge barrier to employment, a huge barrier for agencies to even provide this, and even harder for the psychology student or the post-psychology student to find a postdoc if they're not thinking about finding an expertise in training. Because you pretty much you have to cobble one together, and then you're provided the requirement of 1 hour per week for your supervision. At the same time, creating a little bit of a burden for an agency because you can't bill at the same level. You can't bill as you can be a TLP in Kansas. You still aren't paneled the way that an LP is paneled in Kansas, and so that creates a burden for postdoc supervision. If you create a greater pathway to licensure and they can be licensed, and let's say they do want that postdoc year, well, they can be licensed during that postdoc year. They can bill at the higher rate. They can create less burden on an agency providing that supervision. So I'm not saying I want to get rid of the postdoc year. I am saying I want to get rid of the requirement of postdoc year if they aren't targeting expertise. Now, the one problem that comes with this is that only 18 states have already done this. Missouri is one, so that's great. We have a neighboring state that's already have done this, but that does issue some mobility problems. But I know that from experience when I'm talking to students that I do ask them, I tell them to look for postdoc experiences just so they can increase their mobility. But now with 18 states who don't offer that, many students are looking for internships in those states, staying in those states, and we're losing potentially psychologists to those states. And we have one where all you have to do is cross the river and they can be licensed in Missouri right away. And they usually, those people who get licensed in those states tend to stay in those states. I want to make sure I hit all these notes before I reach my 15-minute mark. Oh, the other aspect too is loan forgiveness plans don't start until you're licensed. So you can't tap into NHSC. Rural supervision is very nil. There's not a lot of rural supervisors out there that can take on the burden of supervision. So you have to offer remote supervision. And even that is, when we look at the requirements of supervision, sometimes that remote supervision is not allowed. And so if we want to put more psychologists in the field, we want them working, we want them seeing everyone, then we need to get licensure to them a little bit quicker. Now, if you look at APA accredited sites, they are already overseeing very rigorous training at the practicum level. They're being supervised by psychologists. They're getting 3 years of supervision that's sequential and complex in nature as they develop. And so the training experience is a lot different than it was 20, 30 years ago when it comes to oversight at the practicum level. And I think that if we were to make this amendment, we want to make sure that those supervision requirements were very clear, that they're not just getting supervision with a master's level clinician, they're getting supervision by a psychologist, and it's sequential and it's overseen by the practicum training team or whatever from on the APA accredited school. Now, know that if they have APA accreditation, they've already gone through the accreditation process to show that their practicums are very rigorous and in preparation and development towards internship. That's all I have.
Thank you very much for the presentation this evening. I want to open this up to questions. Does anybody have questions for Jason or any thoughts that you would like to share regarding the postdoc matter that he has discussed this evening?
I got one comment.
Sure.
So my career started in the military, and I went straight from graduate school into an active duty psychology internship. And one of the things that we were told was you're not going to start getting essentially your credit for time in service towards your service obligation and your ability to pull bonuses and a number of things until you're officially licensed. So the military process is that they tell you can, since you're going to work in a federal institution, you can get a license in any state as long as you're working in the federal system. And so they push for the non-postdoc states because it's faster. So I actually started, I was in Hawaii at the time. I got my license in Arizona because that's one of the non-postdoc states. And then once I moved here, I worked at Fort Riley for a while and kept my Arizona license until it hit a point where I could do reciprocity and switch over to a Kansas license. But I ultimately, given that we've got a major military institution here, we are probably, anybody who is going to be here is not going to be licensed here unless we make it feasible for them. So
Okay. Yeah. So more of a comment in
right,
towards.
in favor. It's ultimately there's a subset of the system that is chasing those opportunities and licensing in those states. I've never set foot in Arizona and practiced, but I paid them for a license for like 5 years. So
That's good. Thank you for that comment. I didn't have that information of another area where psychologists would benefit from this.
Chris, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just have a comment and a question. For me, I'm very supportive of this as well. My question is, have you looked into at the state level our training programs and what those averages are for practicum experiences? And would this requirement succeed in helping them get licensed faster? I think we just have Wichita State and KU are the only doc programs, but I don't know if you know how much practicum experience they're getting pre-internship.
So a few years ago, as we were looking at this, we did ask them for their hours, and this would absolutely benefit. They're getting quite a few hours. I was trying to think what it was. I think it was like 600 or 700 direct hours. So they're, I'm at a PsyD program in Missouri. I teach there and I also practice in Kansas, and we require bare minimum 1,500 total hours. And then our direct hours are somewhere within the 600 to 700 range, depending on how many more hours. So a lot of our students, a lot of our most competitive students hit that 2,000 hour mark. So this would absolutely benefit those students. And part of my amendment would be also, so our requirement is 1,800 hours. Many of our students go above 1,800 hours. They get closer to 2,000. And so like Missouri talks about a post-internship hours, which means once they reach their requirement, I don't know what the requirement is, might be 1,500. They allow those accumulated hours after that to also count. So most people get more than 1,800 hours at their internship because they're working 40-hour weeks. So it would absolutely benefit all of the current Kansas PhD programs for sure.
And I can speak for clinical,
absolutely.
Obviously there's counseling as well, but, we require at least 500 hours, but all of our students on average get between 600 and 800 contact hours. And actually most of our graduates get now licensed in states that don't require a postdoc. We have a ton that do. I do those attestations all the time. So to me, it's a great benefit to the state of Kansas. I think it will help us with retention of our students that end up going other places. So I'm all for it 100%. And I know that counseling is fairly comparable to us. They're probably a little less as far as contact hours, but very comparable.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question regarding which states do not require or no longer require the postdoc. Which are the higher population states or the more populated states? Do you know offhand?
Let me see, I had a list in front of me. So we have, well, Arizona, Connecticut, well, North Dakota, not so much, Washington, Indiana, Maryland, Ohio, Wyoming, Virginia, Massachusetts, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New Hampshire, Kentucky, and Missouri. So those are and Alabama has never required a postdoc. So Alabama's in that group too. So there's a kind of a mixture, and a lot of those states do have. I like that. I like that a lot of those states have a rural component too, because that's one of their pushes is making sure it's really hard to get supervision, and getting a clinician in a rural area. It would be really nice to be able to get somebody licensed and they can be in that rural area a lot quicker, and without the requirement of having to see somebody once a month. And I'll tell you, for somebody who didn't target expertise and I just wanted to work in the field, a general psychologist, I put a postdoc together, and my training was more rigorous at my practicum level than it was at my postdoc level, just because I was already working fully independent, and I would do an hour of supervision just to make sure I met my requirement for Kansas. It just added another year to my ability to be more financially stable, is all it did. Now, if you want to do the postdoc year, again, we would absolutely encourage that, but to have it for the necessary like board certification, like neuropsych. You want to be a neuropsychologist, you're required to do those 2 years. We're looking at psychologists who immediately want to get in the field. If you want to get that expertise, then absolutely. And there's opportunity to do that in Kansas too. There are places where you can get that type of supervision in Kansas, and you could still get the hour in Kansas too. You just have, you could pay for supervision wherever you work at, or you could get a lower salary, but you'd be able to negotiate for a much better salary if you're immediately licensable.
Any other questions or comments for
Yeah,
Jay?
I just want to throw in my support as well as somebody who's practiced for, 24 years in the state of Kansas. I came to Kansas immediately following graduate school. I did my quote unquote postdoc year here at the Mental Health Center just as general practice, much like Jason. My practicums were much more intense. I came with a lot of hours. I feel like we're doing a disservice to Kansas having the postdoc year. As a COO of a mental health center that has primary care, I find it ironic that I can hire an MD who's fresh out of school and they're fully licensed, but I can't hire a psychologist fresh out of school and have them be fully licensed. So I think as you think about parity and those sort of things, as we become more integrated and looking at how we fit with the medical side of healthcare, I think there's an equivalency there that I think we should come out fully licensed as well. There was no, and I did the National Health Service core loan repayment, so I had to wait that extra year till I was fully licensed before I could apply for that. And I know there's a lot of psychologists I've known over the years that didn't come to Kansas simply because they didn't want that hassle.
Thank you, Doug.
I would say that I'm like definitely supportive of this as well. I was actually teaching today, and this conversation came up with somebody that just took a job in Mississippi, partially going straight into a faculty role in Mississippi without having to do a postdoc year. However, I do have a question about, like, are we going to then put some additional requirements and or oversight into possible like what practicum hours, like the locations and the types of supervision that are getting counted as it relates to licensure? And or are we going to also, on the other side of it, like going through board certification, going to put in clauses of like recognizing that this may impact their ability to move forward for board certification in specific areas if they don't have that postdoctoral fellowship year?
Well, I still think it's very important that students understand the board certification path. And so if they're wanting to get board certified, that's on the student, that the program, whatever internship. So I understand that. And I understand that I want to make sure too, as a professor, but also as a role model, that I make sure that I pass that information on. But I also know that that when it comes to people who want to get licensed right away, that's a little bit different story. So understanding the path is key for sure. But I have no problem making sure that we look at what this. For me, it's more about like the supervision. Were they supervised by a licensed psychologist? Was it overseen by an APA accredited program? I don't mind having those stipulations in there of making sure that we feel comfortable with the hours that are signed off on. I know that APA accredited sites, those practicum hours are those are scrutinized. They've been accredited. Those supervisors, they have site visits every year. There's a big process that goes through who can supervise and who can't. So I have no problem putting that in writing, making sure that those hours look like this. And maybe even you can always, I think other states have put a cap on what you could utilize, so like 1,500 hours and they still would have to, but even then that's a little bit more months where they have to get supervised. I'd like the opportunity for somebody to get that done in 2 years with the internship and then whatever the years before the internship. So I don't have any problem with that. And if that's something that would want to be added to that, I would look at what other states have done. And unfortunately, they're not as consistent when it comes to that. They usually go, hey, if the program approved it, we approve the hours. And so it's kind of like figuring out if you trust the programs. And if it's APA accredited, I think it's just like with everything else. It's a checkbox, right? Did you come from an APA accredited site? We trust APA in those sites. If it isn't, then it has to be equivalent and they have to prove it. So the proving, just like with our education, they'd have to go through that approval process, just like on the application of like, what classes did you have? You know, because we allow for non-accredited licensure, right? I'm pretty sure like academic wise, you just have to prove the equivalency. And so I think it'd have to go through the same, Jessica, I think it'd have to go through that same process if they didn't come from an accredited program. And I think I'm trying to remember if, does there have to be like accredited APA internship program too on licensure? Is there a checkbox for that too? David, do you know, or anybody know?
Yes, sir. I believe at least when
Yeah.
I went through schooling that there is, you want to go to an APA approved credited internship.
Yeah, or equivalency. I
Sure.
think we still have equivalency in there. So it just have to be, if it's an equivalency and not APA credit, they'd have to prove it just like they did with everything else.
I do want to make one other. Is it okay?
So I'll let you
That
complete
question.
it. I'm sorry, I'll let you complete that, Mark, and that'll be our last comment because we
Okay.
are kind of bucking up against a wall here with time. But please, Mark, go ahead.
Okay. I'm in a rural area. I have been in for 50 years almost now. And right now there's a tremendous shortage of licensed clinical psychologists being able to perform testing. There's a 6 to 12 month waiting period, if not more, in my area. That's no exaggeration whatsoever. I am 100% behind, what, Jason's talked about, 100%. We are hurting desperately in our area, Reno County, and then points west. I have people drive 200 miles to get a bariatric evaluation, psychological evaluation done. I'm not exaggerating. People from even 270 miles away, Goodland, Bird City, St. Francis, Elkhart, and there's a tremendous need. So anything to accelerate the process of having licensed psychologists be able to get approved quicker, I'm 100% behind that. And again, I'm in a situation here where we're desperate, really, for almost desperate, if I will even use that word, to get people with the level of training that myself and my peers, right now have to, on the advisory committee to help out with the shortage with these evaluations. Again, I'm not exaggerating. 6 to 12 month waiting period to get tested in our area and points west of Reno County. That's all I need to say on that.
Thank you, Mark. And also thank you, Jessica. I didn't get a chance to wrap up what I said to you.
Well, I would like to thank you for coming online this evening to talk about what is a very important topic. I think that we could spend a couple of hours talking about this alone. And please do come back to the committee with updates, and we would be more than happy to hear what has gone on.
Okay, sounds good. I'll talk with David a little bit too about this process and try to figure it out. I also want to thank you. This has been something that Dr. Teresa Connington has always been really interested in. She never got a chance to get this over the finish line. So I hope that we could do that too. So anyway, I just wanted to pass that on.
No, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
So I'll move us on to the next item on the agenda, and that's to review and approve the minutes from our last meeting on the 8th of October. You all had received the minutes previous to the meeting. Are there any questions, or does anyone have any addenda for the minutes from last time? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting.
I approve it.
So Mark, do I have a second?
Second.
Doug seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, same sign. So the motion passes. Now we'll move on to the executive director's report. Dave, please go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. We'll go ahead and start with a couple of BSRB operations notes. I'll talk about a couple items from the last board meeting, but I'll try to keep my report a little bit shorter than normal today. We have a number of items on the agenda, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about as many of those as possible. So first, in terms of BSRB operations, we have been working with CE Broker, and that is a company the board has partnered with over the last year to provide a service to our licensees. Essentially what CE Broker is a company that offers a service to licensing boards like the BSRB and individual licensees in terms of providing a platform for them to upload documentation that shows they've completed continuing education. It also provides a place for them to find additional CE courses, and the services they offer to licensing boards like the BSRB are free. They have optional paid accounts if you want additional services from them, but this is sort of their model. And they've already had an agreement with the Board of Nursing, the Board of Healing Arts, and so BSRB was the third agency in Kansas that partnered with them. We've been rolling that out for the profession so far. 4 of them have been rolled out. The additional last 3 will be coming live here sometime in the next month. And the feedback we received has been mostly positive. People have the ability to go ahead and activate an account, upload documentation, and then the reason why that's important, twofold. One, for licensees, when you renew your license, you have to show that you completed all of your continuing education hours if you're audited at that time. And so the current process is to follow up with those people, make sure that we get all that documentation, have it reviewed, and it can take a little bit of time with the back and forth. If someone has used CE Broker and uploaded their documentation and they're selected for audit, we can log into the portal, view the documentation. There's even ways to put CE hours in certain categories. You can assign a certificate as ethics hours or assign it as diagnosis and treatment. And so if somebody did that and we pulled them for audit, looked in the portal, they had everything they needed, their audit is complete. And so this should be a nice way for us to become more efficient as a licensing board. And like I said, also provide a service to licensees. You don't have to hold on to that documentation on the chance that you're going to be audited or not. So far, it's been really positive. We've been working with a couple of small issues, but overall it's going pretty well. And happy to be working with the eBroker for that purpose. Another operational note, we are fast approaching the start of the legislative session for 2025. Just found out a couple of announcements last night in terms of some chairs of committees. And so every year the BSRB does go before the legislature. As a state agency, we submit a budget and the governor makes a recommendation in terms of how much money we can spend in any given year. And then the legislature can make further adjustments. So every year I go before a House Budget Committee and then a separate Senate committee that make individual recommendations, and then we move forward. Separately, if the board does ask for a bill to be introduced, I go forward on behalf of the board and seek to have that bill receive a hearing on one side, and then if it is passed by that chamber, seek to have the bill receive a hearing on the other side, and then have that move forward. And then once it goes to the governor's office, if it's signed into law, then those are things that we can implement to further help licensees or applicants. So we have a special board meeting coming up on Monday, December 16th, and that is for the board to finalize any items for a legislative agenda. Additionally, if we have any bills this session before the legislature that would affect the BSRB, the board generally authorizes me to go and present testimony concerning any bills that would affect the BSRB. And if there's opportunity, sometimes the board has special meetings to weigh in specifically on some of those bills as they affect the BSRB. But in the meanwhile, over the last month or two, I've been trying to increase outreach efforts to talk to different groups about some of their legislative priorities. Over the last few weeks, I've met in particular with an individual who is interested in having art therapy licensure come before the legislature this year as a proposal. There's also a couple of groups from Wichita or Sedgwick County. One is called the Center for Excellence, and they had a number of different legislative priorities. So I talked with a representative of that group a little as far as some of the items that they're interested in. And then there is another group that is the Behavioral Health Substance Coalition, also a group from Sedgwick County. And they had a number of items that were relevant to the work of the BSRB. I am happy to report, at least through those initial conversations with that group, a number of their legislative priorities appear at least to be items that the BSRB board was able to address through a bill that passed last year. And so I'm seeking some clarification if they would like to go further on some of those issues, but at least a number of the topics that they had identified, it seems like those are things the board is also familiar with and aware of, and some of those things I think we may have just recently put in place things that will address some of those concerns. So gearing up for the session, they did announce the chair of the House Health and Human Services Committee in terms of those appointments, and that person chairing that committee will be Representative Will Carpenter. Will Carpenter has been in the legislature for several years now. I knew him actually in a different role when I used to work as a principal fiscal analyst for the Legislative Research Department. He is someone who has past history chairing the Social Services Budget Committee. I believe during the last legislative session, he was also chair of House Fed and State. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for Representative Will Carpenter and look forward to working with him in that role. I don't believe I've seen appointments for the Senate Health and Human Services or Health and Public Health and Welfare Committee just yet, but looking forward to finding out that information and developing those contacts as well. Turning to some of the other operations updates, I'll just briefly talk about a couple items that the board discussed at the last board meeting that occurred on November 4th. And the board met briefly and we delivered some updates. There were a few items for potential legislative action. One of those had to do with some unusual language that was included in the statutes for the addiction counseling profession and also the marriage and family therapy profession. There is a construction of act statute that basically, in a broad sense, says if you're providing these types of services, you need to be licensed by the BSRB. There are some carve-outs, particularly for students and interns, but there was also some language that said, or individuals preparing for the practice of, marriage and family therapy or addiction counseling. But that phrase, preparing for the practice of addiction counseling, had never fully been defined and was a bit vague. And so we had brought those to the individual advisory committees to say, is this intended to help out a certain group of individuals? If not, we need to define this to make sure that we are regulating the professions appropriately. And if it's not helpful, maybe we should ask that it be removed from the statute. So both advisory committees recommended to the board removing that language. So we will be pursuing that. The board did recommend that as well. And so the carve outs for students and interns, nothing changes there. It's just that vague language about preparing for the practice of addiction counseling or marriage and family therapy. There was also an amount of discussion this year on the topic of supervision and who could provide supervision in certain professions. The most request for flexibility in this area that we've received this year has been in the profession of professional counseling. Some individuals have asked us if they could have someone from another profession provide supervision rather than a clinical professional counselor. And so we do have a board certified process that is in law for the professional counseling profession and marriage and family therapy, but there is a small exception that people can meet if they can show an extenuating circumstance for needing someone from another profession to provide that supervision. But it is a pretty high bar to reach, so it's difficult for people to reach that threshold. And so we were listening to comments from the advisory committee. We also asked the Kansas Counseling Association to weigh in, and they similarly thought that the majority of supervision should be provided by clinical professional counselors. But we were also hearing comments from individuals in workplaces that were asking for additional flexibility in terms of helping out with workforce shortages and things like that. So as a compromise proposal, the counselor advisory committee put forward to the board a request for statutory language that would require that half the hours be provided by someone who is a board-approved clinical professional counselor, and allow for up to half the hours to be provided by someone from another profession, as long as they have a sufficient license at a certain level under the BSRB. And so this wouldn't necessarily indicate that everyone would be splitting their supervision, but it would provide a little more flexibility to address both concerns. And so the proposal has only been brought forward currently for the professional counseling profession, but that is something they brought to the board, and the board recommended pursuing that in law to allow some additional flexibility for counselors providing supervision. And then the other item was a recommendation from this advisory committee, and that had to do with two changes, recommended changes to the educational regulations. One had to do with the current regulation requirement, which says if an individual attended an APA accredited program, they would still need to meet the specific coursework listed in the education regulation. The advisory committee previously recommended that if someone attended an APA accredited program and received that education, that should be sufficient for them to move forward. But the specific coursework requirement, that was really specific to individuals who attended non-accredited schools to establish that educational equivalency. So the board did recommend pursuing that and making that a regulatory change. And then there was also the discussion from the advisory committee, the recommendation that currently the language states that a certain number of coursework hours need to be received while the person is in residence. And that is defined at being at the physical institution of the school in front of core faculty, basically while in the physical presence of the core faculty. And the advisory committee had made a recommendation to change that definition of in residence so that it would allow, still had to be a physical location identified by the institution, but not necessarily the physical location of the institution. So it would still require that coursework to be while they were physically present at a location in front of core faculty, but not necessarily the physical location of the school, which would allow for some of the online programs to meet that as long as they had designated those courses to be taught while someone was physically there at a different location. So the board did recommend that as well. Those were two items the board is interested in moving forward with. So I do have an item for you later on in this meeting that I wanted to bring back to you to see if you were in favor of making a small adjustment to that, but just wanted to touch upon those recommendations. And so, but as I can wrap up my report, we will try to say this at the end of the meeting as well, but I've really enjoyed working with all of you in this capacity. Looking forward to working with you again in the following year, but just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you on the advisory committee for your time. The work you do and these recommendations the board received are very thoughtful and considered. And I want to say this model of having advisory committees provide thoughtful recommendations back to the board and the board considering them, I think works extremely well in Kansas. I want to thank all of you for your time and wish you all a happy holiday.
Thank you, Dave. Does anybody have any questions or want to comment on the executive director's report? Seeing none, I'll move on to the next item, and that's an update from ASPPB's annual meeting that was held in late October and early November. Back to you, Dave.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. And I was able to attend the annual meeting from the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB. I attended that meeting in Dallas, Texas, with board member Linda Heitzman Powell as well. So I'll go ahead and share some of my takeaways, but Linda, please feel free to add anything as well. One of the major topics I wanted to bring back to you, you may recall that there was a lot of discussion going into this meeting that had to do with a choice that the board of ASPPB had made a couple of years ago, that they had put in place a requirement that as of January 1st, 2026, any states that wish to use the licensing exam, the EPPP, would have to require that their applicants pass the EPPP2. And there was discussion about the EPPP traditionally being thought of as a knowledge-based exam, and the EPPP2 being referred to as more of a skills assessment. The proposal that ASPPB had made with their board and the decision they made was that as of January 1st, 2026, they would consider these two tests to be one test with two parts. But there was a tremendous amount of concern from different states about the cost, and that there were two separate costs, I believe, 600 for the EPPP and about 450 for the EPPP2. There were concerns about the cost factor and also passage of a second test being a unnecessary barrier to licensure and preventing people from being able to enter the workforce. And then there were concerns by a few different states, specifically Texas, that they may not be able to get this passed through their legislature, and that their legislature would not require passage of the EPPP2, then they would have no licensing test for psychologists. And that would leave them in a position to where they would not have a test available as a licensing tool. And so what they had proposed was a bylaw amendment to the ASPPB association to basically allow states to make the decision on their own, either to require passage of the EPPP2 or not. And so gearing up to this, representatives from ASPPB attended one of your advisory committee meetings, explained the development of both tests. There was discussion by the advisory committee about should the BSRB go forward and support the bylaw amendment from Texas. And ultimately there was a recommendation to the board to support the bylaw amendment and go ahead and bring that position to the annual meeting. The master's level psychology similarly discussed the item, made a recommendation to the board to also support the bylaw amendment from Texas. And ultimately the board received those recommendations and indicated that they also agreed and wanted us to support the Texas bylaw amendment. So going into this meeting, about a week before it was going to happen, the board of ASPPB met again and came out with a letter that was drafted that basically is in your packet of material, and said that they are pausing their position and they are no longer going to be requiring passage of the EPPP2 from all jurisdictions as of January 1st, 2026. There was still the question of should the bylaw amendment vote take place at the meeting? Should that go forward? And with that decision by the board of ASPPB so close to the annual meeting, the individuals who brought that bylaw amendment decided to continue to move forward with that. I think in part to make sure that appropriate discussions took place and that people had the opportunity to be heard. And so at the annual meeting, there were a couple of opportunities for that. I specifically asked the board members during one forum if they could comment on their use of the word pause in the letter that they put forward announcing their decision. Because in that letter that basically said they would no longer be requiring passage of the part 2 as of that date, they said that they were pausing their decision. And the word pause makes me a little uncomfortable because anything that can be paused can be unpaused. And I just wanted them to see if they could share what they really meant by that. And so a number of board members did share and said it was not our intention to temporarily pause this and then unpause it after the annual meeting to bring it back on state. We have heard all the discussion. We really have taken it to heart. We want to have a task force that really looks at how do we implement these two different things more cohesively, and then bring that back in the future when it's really ready for more discussion. And so there were some strong feelings. This was probably the most tense annual meeting that I have gone to, but that's not a bad thing. This is an important topic. I shared that even though they had made that change, we would still support the bylaw because that was the last direction I received from the board. And I couldn't say whether the board would change their minds unless we had another meeting of the board. And so we went forward to ask the bylaw amendment be passed. Several other states, though, said, I'm unsure my board would still support the bylaw amendment because the board of ASPPB has changed their mind on this issue. So ultimately, procedurally, there was a vote to go ahead and postpone the vote until a future meeting, and that did not have enough votes to pass. There was a motion to withdraw the bylaw amendment, and that did not pass. And so ultimately, it came down to a vote on the amendment, The amendment did not pass. The bylaws were not amended, but I think through all of this discussion and all of this meeting, the major takeaway is the board of ASPPB was persuaded not to make that a mandatory requirement as of January 1st, 2026. And their new proposal is to have this task force come together and really try to do this in the right way. Now, whatever they come forward with, I will keep you updated. If they come forward with something that's going to be the same cost, there may be the same concern. If there is something that is still spread across 2 different days, there may be the same concern. So I will keep you updated, but I do want to share that it is good news overall, because individuals will not be required to pass those 2 tests or pay those costs. But like I said, I'll keep you updated. The rest of the conference, there were good speakers. There were topics like artificial intelligence, but I didn't want to bury the lead, so I thought I'd focus most of the time just kind of explaining that process. But I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful consideration of those topics, and our discussions were very valuable. And I did my best to represent the board and the advisory committee's opinions and positions at that meeting. So I'll turn it over to Linda and see, Linda, do you have any other takeaways or any comments you want to make about that meeting?
Yeah, I just want to say that we are very fortunate to have David as our fearless leader and with that attorney background, because especially when you're talking about the word pause, like what does that word pause mean, right? Who would think to ask that except for maybe an attorney? So thank you, David, very much for that. And I do have to say that it was a really exhilarating experience to watch democracy in play, and it highlighted that the voices of people with legitimate concerns, if you persevere, then you can make a difference. And so I just thought that was, really beneficial to watch in action. It was a good conference. We missed you, Richard, at that conference. Thank you for allowing me to go and help represent Kansas.
No, thank you for attending. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend, but I will be going to the mid-year meeting in a few months. And I also want to thank all of you for your thoughtful discussion on this matter. I know that we spent a fair bit of time talking about it. And I too am glad that a process that was democratic prevailed in this instance. So thank you all for facilitating in that endeavor too. Any other matters, David, with regards to ASPPB?
The only thing that I'll comment on is usually at these types of conferences, there's an opportunity for me to learn what's going on in other states. And I try to bring some of that back to help out if I can see different items to make improvements. And I did write down a number of those things in my notes. But the major one I wanted to share with you is that something neat that I'm seeing is there is a trend that states are reshaping some of their boards in different ways. And I am seeing a number of states reshape their boards to resemble something very similar to the BSRB in Kansas. So in some states, you have separate boards for, a separate psychology board, a separate social work board, a separate counseling board. And sometimes when you have that, if there's not enough licensees, there's not enough operating revenue to really do things, in my opinion, in a way that's effective and efficient. And so sometimes with those smaller boards, that means that board members themselves are the ones that have to review all the applications, or sometimes do the investigations and actually call people when there's complaints and collect all that information. And I think that's really problematic for a few different reasons, because you're wearing too many hats, in my opinion. There needs to be some level of separation. And there's also been, some lawsuits over the last few years in certain states where there's been a controlling interest of one profession on a board, and accusations that perhaps there are too many members of that profession that are sort of gatekeeping people coming into the profession. And so what we have here in Kansas, is a composite board where we have 7 different professions all together working as one, and we have 8 professional members, 4 public members. And so no one profession has a controlling interest of that. But I think the board in Kansas really works effectively, really well. And part of that is through the work of the advisory committee. And so one thing that I've seen recently in Utah, they have made a composite board for a lot of their mental health or behavioral health professions. Iowa recently also was reshaped to have something almost identical to the BSRB. In fact, I don't know if they call them advisory committees, but they also have standing committees that are for each profession that meet and make recommendations back to the board. And there was one other state that just made a change like this as well. So it's neat to see other states kind of following the model of the BSRB or being reshaped to kind of work in this way too. And now I may be a little biased, but I think it's a really good, effective model. But it's also kind of, it makes me feel good that other states are moving in this direction too, because I've seen it work pretty well so far. And it gives me an opportunity to also kind of work with those representatives from other states when they come in and they're very anxious about how are we going to make all this work. I can at least offer some support for them and say, be happy to help you out anyway in terms of what we've done, and try to learn from them as well through that process. So I wanted to communicate that back to you as well.
Can I jump in again, David? There are two other things that were discussed at that meeting. One is also a trend on deregulation. And so I think we all need to be aware of that. We don't want to go back to the point where our profession or our job as a regulatory board doesn't have the ability to regulate our members, right? And that the regulations around each one of our professions is watered down to the point that we start getting people in the field that maybe shouldn't be practicing. And so I think it's something everybody really needs to be aware of. The other thing is, because this is states and provincial, which means we have Canadian representation at that meeting. And there was a very significant case that happened in Canada, and it had to do with a professional that was representing themselves as a psychologist on social media and was engaging in unethical behavior and was sanctioned by the board. And it caused a bunch of legal maneuvering. And so I think that's also really important for us to think about as an advisory committee and a board, that we make sure that we're documenting, and when we do sanctions, we have all our ducks in a row, because they also were, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, a fee funded organization like us. And, if you get one of those really high profile cases, you run the risk of bankrupting the organization. So I just think that's really important to keep in mind as well. Thank you.
Any questions for Dave or for Linda regarding the ASPPB annual meeting?
For the task force, did they give any kind of timeline for how long this newly created task force was going to review things and when they might have a new proposal?
I think they're looking for people to volunteer for the task force this coming spring. I don't know if they've talked about how long that group is going to be meeting. I think right now they want to give that group a chance to really kind of put together some thoughts and maybe do some research. And they haven't really set an end date goal. It's been more of, looking for any interested individuals to volunteer to work on that group. And I know, separately, there's been some conversations by people that originally were in favor of the bylaw amendment to say, should there be some other efforts sort of along those same lines. And so the task force is one method. Separately, some of these things that came to light during this process, the bylaws for ASPPB had not been amended in 11 years. And in my opinion, that's probably too long. There needs to be some updating and changes. And also, this is an organization, if you're not the most familiar with that association, it's an association that is meant to assist regulatory boards. And really, the members are representatives from regulatory boards. And so individuals like the BSRB or, the representatives from Kansas and other states, we have the ability to make recommendations and change the nature of the association. So if it needs to evolve and become something different, to become something more effective, we can definitely play a role in that process too. So the short answer is I don't have an end date for that goal, but in terms of when they'd like that to start, I think they would like that to start this spring. And I'll be talking to some people, I think, next week, and I hope to get a sense of representatives from which states to see if they're interested in becoming members of that task force or the plan going forward.
Anyone else with questions or anything they'd like to add? I quickly would like to add that yes, there has been an ongoing discussion at ASPPB about matters of deregulation. And Linda, thank you so much for bringing that up. This is, I think, going to be an especially important topic as AI continues to evolve, and it's and the role that it might play in the work that we as psychologists do. I think that we will need to be abreast and to be aware of the ways in which there might be regulatory practices that will be either increased or matters of deregulation. So I appreciate that there was a discussion about that, and I'm sure that we will discussing that again at the mid-year conference. It'll be an ongoing discussion. That said, I'll move us on to the next item on the agenda, and that's an update on SIPAC, the multi-state compact, and I'll hand it over to Dave.
Okay. As we discussed, I believe at our last meeting, attending the annual meeting for SIPAC was going to be my last act as SIPAC commissioner, and Richard is now the new compact commissioner for Kansas. Really happy to be supporting him in that role. The SIPAC annual meeting did take place in Washington, D.C., November 18th through 19th. The overall takeaway for the annual meeting is that SIPAC is firmly established and continues to grow. Just to let you know, back in about 2019, about 12 or 13 states were part of that compact. Now, I think it is probably up to somewhere around 42 or 43 states. So it's a lot easier to count the states that are not part of the compact than it is the ones that are in the compact. In terms of the number of people that hold the authorization to provide telehealth, also known as APIT holders, there are nationwide 14,632 of those individuals. And then there's also the opportunity to be able to practice physically in another compact state for up to 30 days during the course of a year, called a TAP. And there's about 872 individuals nationwide who hold those. During the last year, there were also 9,805 people who renewed their SIPAC privilege. So there's a lot of people who have been very interested to explore that as a method of providing service, but there's also a significant number of people that have decided this is something worth continuing. So I think it has been firmly established now. I think you've probably seen this in your own individual practices, but clients are getting more comfortable with telepsychology, and I think some psychologists are getting more comfortable with that for sure. We did have the opportunity to talk with maybe one or two presenters that were talking about broad topics, and I asked them if they have heard any issues with people billing for services using a privilege compared to a license, if that was creating any kind of confusion, and it appeared not to be really an issue, at least not one that people were remarking, which was good. I don't have the most involvement with the reimbursement side of things here in the office. It's mostly outside of our jurisdiction, but I've been trying to be helpful in that area. So it's nice to know that's not an issue. I'm sure there's certain differences between getting authorization to practice under one compact or getting a privilege to practice under another, or perhaps a multi-state license, which the social work one will be. So good to hear that's not really a factor in terms of making things more complicated. SIPAC is currently funded primarily in three ways. People initially getting their privilege, the renewal fees, and then also assessments on states. And this was something that was put in when SIPAC was starting to become operational. There is one of their fees that is a look back. And so for any state that has members in SIPAC, the SIPAC Commission bills that state $10 per year per psychologist who practices the home state license. So basically, Kansas has been paying part of the SIPAC operational fees for the last couple of years. And that is part of the reason why when the SIPAC bill was passed, there was some language that allowed us to charge individuals upon renewal if they were practicing under SIPAC authority a fee up to $25. But one of the topics at this meeting was whether that yearly assessment should continue on states, or if SIPAC is operationally sound and financially sound, does that need to continue? And looking at the financial picture of SIPAC, SIPAC is financially sound. They are bringing in more revenue than they need to balance. And so they're starting to have a conversation about investments for their additional revenue. And so I brought up the topic about the assessment. They basically asked for one more year to make sure that their finances were going to be sound, but they did promise to revisit that conversation over the course of the next year as they collect more data. So just want to let you know I'm kind of pushing that issue just to make sure that we have not let that topic rest. I think if they no longer charge the assessment, there would not really be a reason for the BSRB to be charging that fee for our own home state license holders as well. So another topic we talked about was collection of data. So there was a question when SIPAC was enacted whether states would lose licensees because individuals that live out of state that have a home state license somewhere else may choose to let their licenses lapse and practice under SIPAC authority instead if they're only providing telehealth services. And so the question was, what would the impact be on different states should that occur? Well, in Kansas, all licensed psychologists renew by even numbered years in June of even numbered years. And we did have numbers that I shared with the SIPAC commission. I let them know, here's how many total licensees we have. And then at least in June of this year, at the end of the year, about 120 licensed psychologists did not renew their license. Of that total, about 20 individuals were still listed on the SIPAC portal as providing services under SIPAC, which means to me that there were about 20 people whose home state license is outside of Kansas. And those are basically people who previously lived outside of Kansas and had been using a Kansas license and now have made the choice to let their Kansas license expire, but are practicing potentially in Kansas using SIPAC authority. So we sort of have a number now, at least quantifiable for Kansas. Now, alternatively, SIPAC has been collecting data in terms of what states people have been providing telehealth services into. And I've been looking at that number. And basically every quarter, from what I can see, it looks like there's about 40 additional psychologists that are providing services into Kansas. So over the course of a year, about 150 to 160 psychologists who are licensed in other states are providing services into Kansas through the SIPAC authority, which is good. It's really good. The item I don't know is how many services or what number, are they helping one person? Are they providing 1 hour of service into Kansas? So how do we quantify that? So there was a push for more data to be collected as we try to redefine workforce. Instead of looking at a number of people that are working 40 hours in one specific state, now that people are sharing services across state lines, how do we redefine workforce? And that's one of the topics that we spent a little time talking about. So, but overall, it was a really positive meeting. Overall, SIPAC is in good financial standing. I think we have kind of hit a plateau in terms of number of states that have joined, but there are still efforts to try to have the last remaining states join the compact too. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions on the SIPAC annual meeting.
Well, seeing none, thank you, Dave, for the update on SIPAC, and I look forward to picking things up where you had left them. Thank you for your service to being the commissioner of SIPAC for the state of Kansas for the time that you had been commissioner, and we appreciate all your hard work and your time and energy as you have devoted into that endeavor.
Thank you, Richard.
You're very welcome. So we have three Roman numerals left, and one of them is going to take about 30 minutes, and that's the annual training for the advisory committees. What I would like to do is move Roman numeral 9 and 10A up to have a discussion about education regulations that have been discussed and proposed. And if we have any remaining time, we could talk about other items under new business and then move number 8 down at around 7:30 so that, or 7:35, so that we can begin the training for the advisory committee. So Dave, I'll have you introduce the topics of, and you can combine them or stack them any way that you would like, moving on to 9 and 10A regarding education regulations.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Actually, let's go ahead and talk about 10A first. I've gone ahead and pulled that document up, and then I'll circle back around to 9. I mentioned during or earlier on during the meeting that the board was in favor of the 2 recommendations concerning the educational requirements for licensure, and that is KAR 102-1-12. In working through this with Leslie Allen and also looking at, whether there should be sort of a syncing up of the new in-residence definition for the master's level psychology profession, as that is a profession that also requires some of the coursework to be physically, done in person. It occurred to me that right now, 4 of the professions have changed their definition of in-residence to mean either physically at the school or by synchronous video conferencing by screen. But we've also looked at changing the definition for the psychology profession to require that to be physically still in person, but not necessarily at the institution, but at a physical location chosen by the institution. The problem that I see there is that we now have 2 different definitions for the same term. And if someone from the legislature, perhaps, or from the public were to ask us, what do you mean when you say in residence? I feel a little uncomfortable saying, well, if I'm wearing my addiction counseling hat, it means this. If I'm wearing my psychology hat, it means this. So what I wanted to bring back to you today is, instead of using the in-residence definition and having it mean 2 different things, to kind of resolve that issue, I thought perhaps it'd be more helpful if we basically took that in-residence term and just kind of struck that from the definitions for the psychology regulation. And then where that was used in the regulation, we can use the new language to say exactly what we mean. So instead of having a term that means 2 different things, just remove that term from the regulation, and then where it was used before, we can just say the actual language. And I'll share my screen here and just kind of show you exactly what I mean. Pulling up here a draft copy of KAR 102-1-12. This is the educational requirements regulation for psychology. And here is at the bottom, by the way, changes are identified in green. Yellow is just kind of for emphasis, so you can follow some of these items a little bit better. In residence, the previous definition talked about being physically present at the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and 1 or more core faculty members are in physical proximity and face-to-face contact. What I wanted to bring before you today to get your thoughts on and hopefully your approval on making this modification is, instead of using that and altering the definition, just going ahead and striking the definition from page 2. And then this is also a reference to essentially the number of course hours that would need to be while the person was in residence. And then down to the specific coursework where the in-residence would apply. That's on page 9. The methods of diagnosing and defining problems through psychological assessments and measurements, and the strategies and techniques of therapeutic intervention or remediation, a minimum of 24 semester hours in the substantive area or the equivalent number of quarter or trimesters credit hours shall be completed by the student while the student is, and then strike the term in residence and just say that'll be completed while the student is present at the physical location identified by the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and 1 or more core faculty members are in physical proximity and face-to-face contact. And then the rest of that language is not changed. So just kind of, I thought this would be a nice way to clean this up and avoid any potential issues, and also try to eliminate some confusion from members of the public or applicants when, or even the schools when they're trying to make sure their coursework is meeting the standard. So, and I believe that's the only change for your regulation for the master's level psychology profession. I brought them a similar recommendation, and they agreed with striking the in-residence definition from their regulation. And then also they agreed that testing can still be done in the physical presence of the faculty members. So they used the literal language of the definition rather than the term in residence. So sort of a similar change I wanted to bring to you, but I wanted to sort of explain it because it's a bit unconventional, but I think it'll be helpful in the end. So any of you have any questions about that or any comments about this? It accomplishes the same thing. It's just, I think, cleaner and easier for us to defend if we have any kind of questions or scrutiny.
I had a conversation with Dave about this late last week, and to me, it does make sense to initiate this change. I would want for there though to be open comment from the advisory committee regarding the proposed change to statute. Excuse me, regulation.
And if you do have,
As just another lawyer in the room, I like David's approach. It appeals to me.
well, thank you.
No, thank you, David. I appreciate that.
I think it clarifies it, and the simpler it is, the easier it is for the, people that are applying for this position and for the academic course sequence to make sure I agree.
I
Thank
agree.
you, Linda.
More concise, easier to follow. Yeah, I like it a lot.
I agree with it as well.
I'm for it. I'm for it. It aligns and it's clear.
Is there anyone opposed to said changes? Dave, do you need a vote?
So we could either do a vote or, I mean, it appears to me there's consensus to move this recommendation forward to the board. So I'm happy to take this as a recommendation by consensus to the board and then ask for their approval at the next board meeting if that's sufficient.
No, thank you very much. I think we'll go that route.
Great. The next item had to do, so we have gone through the process of looking at the regulation for continuing education, and this would be under old business item 9. There had been a recommendation to lower the number of continuing education hours for your profession from 50 hours down to 40. And so some of the categories, I believe, had a cap, and Leslie spent a little bit of time trying to sync up some of the requirements to make them a little bit more standardized. So I will share my screen here and show the document that she put together, just so you kind of see what her intention was given the change in hours for a few of the professions. We had talked to each of the different advisory committees about sort of what are the standard number of continuing education hours for your profession. Some of the professions were right in line with the majority of different states. Like marriage and family therapy, the majority of states have 40 credit hours. Addiction counseling, professional counseling, the majority of states have 30 hours. But for social work, we had been requiring 40 hours, and the majority of states have about 30. So that is one profession that recommended lowering theirs. And then for psychology and master's level psychology, the majority of states probably have 40 hours instead of 50 hours. So both those advisory committees had recommended lowering that. So with those hours being lowered, it would basically change some of the maxes for some of these categories. So there's also one here for licensed psychology. Some of the other professions allow cross-disciplinary training related to the profession. This was something that Leslie noted was not in a licensed psychology regulation before. So she would recommend that it be added for consistency with the other professions, but I thought I would highlight that for you as well.
I did have a question.
Go ahead.
The 40 hours, like workshop, seminars, presentation, does that mean that you can get all 40 hours in one area? Right now, I know you have to have like ethics, 4 hours of ethics, for example. That was my question, whether you could, in theory, I'm not saying you will, but in theory, get all 40 hours in one area if you wanted to. Is that what that is saying?
So I think I understand your question, and it's a little bit different. You do still need to meet the certain categories. You do still need to get the 3 hours in ethics, and then at least for the next 6 months, you will need to get the 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment. As of July 1st, 2025, the standard for the diagnosis and treatment, that total does come down from 6 hours every 2 years to 3 hours every 2 years. That was something the legislature passed in a bill last year. But in terms of the method to accrue the hours, you could get all of your hours by this method. You still would need to meet those individual category requirements, though.
I'm with you. So, in theory, with that example, it'd be 6 plus 3 we would need, and then the other 31 in theory could be in workshop or seminars or whatever that listed number of hours are.
Yeah, and you could do all 40 of them in that category, as long as you did a workshop, seminar, or presentation that was 3 hours of ethics, and you did similarly currently 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment. That was.
I'm with you. I understand. That clarifies it. Thank you.
I have a question with respect to the cross-disciplinary training directly related to the profession. How would that be defined, especially the phrase cross-disciplinary?
That's a good question. Let me see if I can find a regulation from another profession that may have that language. I'll go ahead and see if marriage and family therapy has that.
Would that be something like if I do a CE on neuroleptic for controlling, certain psychiatric conditions, and I happen to practice seeing patients that often take psychotropic medication? It's directly related to my profession because I need to be aware of the medication and the side effects. Is that what that would mean?
Actually, let me go ahead and I will stop sharing this screen, and I'll share another screen. I'll give you an example of that. This is how it appears in the marriage and family therapy regulation. This is KAR 102-5-10. So there's that profession. It describes it as a cross-disciplinary offering in medicine, law, the behavioral sciences, a foreign or sign language, computer science, professional and technical writing, business administration, management sciences, or any other discipline, if the offering is clearly related to the enhancement of a marriage and family therapist license practice, values, ethics, skills, or knowledge, the maximum allowable continuing education hours shall be 10. So some slight changes there for the marriage and family therapy and having psychology in its place, but that's at least how that's defined for the MFT.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts or any questions about the hours that would be in each category when it comes to continuing education?
And most of this, I think, was done, Leslie had put forward basically as a way to try to sync up between the professions and then also to readjust given the professions that were decreasing their hours.
And may I quickly just see again which professions have things that we do not have as categories for education?
Yes, let me share my screen again. Here we go. All right. So it appeared that the cross-disciplinary training related to the profession previously was not in there for licensed psychology.
And it
There,
looks like that's the only one.
yeah, there was also a category of, I guess, receiving supervision that marriage and family therapy did not include. So that has been modified a little bit.
So, Dave, what would you need from us to go forward?
I think there doesn't necessarily need to be a recommendation. I think just the board had heard that Leslie wanted to bring these to the advisory committees. I guess if there was a motion or if there's consensus to support these changes, that would be sufficient. I think she just wanted to give the opportunity for the advisory committees to kind of discuss or request any additional changes. So I guess looking to see if there is maybe consensus to move forward on these changes.
Does anyone have any questions or concerns regarding the proposed caps for the categories of continuing education? And just as a reminder, psychologists have the research paper or the scientific research, and that is at 10 hours, I think, or is it at 15? And I bring that up because we do have a number of colleagues across the state that are involved in research, and I would not want to overlook that.
Looks like 15 per paper, a maximum for psychologists of 30 over the 2 years.
So up to 3/4 of what would be the required number of continuing education credits. Any objections to what's been shown? So I think we have consensus that the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee has recommended that those changes be made, and you can forward that on to the board.
Thank you, Richard. I know that concerning the topic of the postdoc year for psychologists, that's probably going to be a lengthier conversation. But there was one other topic under new business, item C, discussion on possible flexibility and supervision. Before I start the training, I just wanted to briefly kind of comment on that item. So I mentioned that I had been meeting with different groups and that the professional counselors had asked the board for basically the ability to request statutory language for a middle of the road type position, something in an effort to preserve professional counselors providing supervision, a compromise type position, knowing that some individuals were requesting flexibility, but also wanted to require that some of the counselors provide supervision as well. And so one of the groups that I have talked to recently had basically said one of their priorities was to have there be more flexibility across the board for BSRB professions, and would like there to be the ability to receive supervision by different professionals for any of the BSRB professions that are seeking clinical license hours. And so I thought it might be helpful just to kind of see if the advisory committee members wanted to weigh in on a proposal like that. It's one thing if professional counselors are seeking to see if a psychologist can provide the supervision hours. But if members of the committee were asked to weigh in on if there was a psychologist and they were asking for flexibility to get the supervision from someone who was a social worker or a professional counselor or marriage and family therapist, is that something the advisory committee members have any thoughts on? There's no proposal before the board, but I thought it might be helpful if the board does think about some proposal in that direction.
I'll open it up to folks who might want to comment.
I would say on the pre-doc side, we allow for a limited number, but typically they have umbrella supervision, so there's lots of agencies that don't have a licensed psychologist on site, and we may never place a practicum students in those agencies in those situations. So they're supervised by a social worker or, may be a master's level person, but we have a PhD here at the university that's then overseeing or giving umbrella supervision. So I'd say that's the typical model. One is there can be just great variance in what that person might be trained in, whether that's assessment training or other theoretical approaches, just differences in models of training. So I think it's concerning to let's just make it wide open. But my opinion is there is room for umbrella supervision because otherwise we just don't get PhD students out into areas where they need to be.
That's a really good point, Sarah.
Yeah, I agree with her. I think getting people out the areas that there's not psychologists in, I think this would be a huge benefit to expand supervision from other licensed disciplines to do psychology postdoc supervision or post degree. I think what I would want is to make sure that the folks doing that would have a C. So they would have their clinical license. They would be at that level. And that would be something that I would be extremely supportive. As long as there's a C, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think having the clinical for whatever their discipline is, but then I would also like to see at least a certain number of hours, even if it was by televideo with an actual psychologist. We don't want to water down what we're doing, but we want to make it easier for people to get supervision.
I kind of have similar thoughts. I think from my perspective, I'd be open to a little bit of flexibility there, but there are some just critical areas. I think of psychological testing and assessment. I know other professions can dip their toes and do that work to a certain degree. And I don't want to minimize that work at all. So I've worked with great master's level clinicians who have worked in psychological assessment before, but I'd be very careful about training, making sure psychologists are getting good training in that area.
I concur with Jay. My thought would be that yes, it can be really good for psychologists to receive training, receive supervision from individuals in other professions. And with respect to assessment, I would want for there to be at least some training that is imparted upon the student from a psychologist. That would be my thing. And I also agree with Chris that I think that it should be the case that the person has a C in their license. They're a clinical level. Anyone else have any thoughts about this topic? Seeing none, Dave, how would you want to move forward on this item? Do you want there to be a formal proposal in terms of what the regulation would say before we move forward?
I think that there's, I think you and I can kind of bring back the comments from the members of the committee. If the board wants to have a conversation about it, I think we can just kind of share the comments without having an official proposal.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Okay. That said, it is 7:30 and we've got just enough time for Dave to start the training on for the advisory committee.
Okay, so this first half of the training has generally taken about 20 to 25 minutes. So we can kind of break this into two pieces, do half of the training today and then half of the training the next meeting. This is the annual training that we do provide for all board members and advisory committee members. Some of it is updates on the agency, and some of it really covers what's in the law. Some of you, especially if you're new, you may have experience working with, for-profit or nonprofit organizations, but as a state agency, there's some different laws we have to follow, and so I always try to like to highlight that for individuals. So I'll share my screen here, and before I get started too, I do want to thank one of our staff members here at the BSRB. Emma is an individual who has been a licensing assistant for us. She has been a part-time staff member for the last couple of years while she's been finishing up her college degree. She recently graduated, and we received authority to make her a full-time employee. And some of her new responsibilities are basically helping me. So she's kind of working a little bit as an assistant for me, so I can take a little bit less of a hands-on approach to some of these things and kind of become a better delegator and share a little bit of oversight and supervision with other people in the office a little bit more. So I asked her to help me with this, and she did a tremendous amount of work. I credit her really with being able to condense the number of slides down from about 140 slides down to about 70. So much cleaner presentation, and it looks nicer too, in my opinion too. So I want to thank Emma before I got started. But I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Again, this is the annual training, and I'll try to allow a little bit of time at the end for some questions, then we'll pick up the second half next meeting. Just to frame the conversation about the training, as a reminder, the BSRB is a state agency, and in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature, the primary mission of the BSRB is to protect and serve consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees. And that is through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulations accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect to all those involved. And we always like to emphasize that while the majority of our time is spent working with licensees, either to help them become licensed or renewed, or investigating complaints, our primary charge is to protect and serve consumers of services. And so we do try to make sure that we remember we're a public protection agency and that sometimes those individuals are especially vulnerable. The history of the agency: the BSRB was established in 1980 to license and regulate psychologists and social workers in Kansas. At the time, there were two independent groups, the State Board of Examiners of Psychology and the Board of Social Work Examiners, and the legislature put those two groups together. And then over the years, the BSRB's jurisdiction has expanded to include the licensure of professional counselors, master's level psychologists, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and most recently, behavior. One term that we are known by in other states and also here in Kansas is a composite board. Rather than have a separate board for each of the professions, there is one board, and it is composed of professional members and also public members. And some of the benefits of having a composite board is that the agency saves on operational expenditures by sharing resources, utilizing licensing and investigative staff for similar subject areas. Another way to understand the work of the BSRB is to contrast it with an association. So regulatory boards exist to protect consumers, are created by the legislature, and are governed by statute, whereas associations exist to enhance the profession and are sometimes created by members of that profession. The BSRB staff employs 12 individuals, including myself, the assistant director and licensing manager, licensing specialist, investigators, and also clerical staff. We are a fee-funded agency. What that means is that we don't receive any money directly from the state or the state general fund for operations by statute, although we do contribute 10% of all the revenue we receive up to a cap of $100,000 per year back to the state to help fund state operations. The agency earns its revenue primarily from licensing fees, and the annual budget is a little over $1.1 million. The board itself, all board members are appointed by the governor, and they serve a 4-year term. Board members may be reappointed for a second term, allowing service on the board for a maximum of 8 consecutive years. And in statute, it does specifically say that the board will be composed of 1 addiction counselor, 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 master's level psychologist, 1 professional counselor, 2 licensed psychologists, 2 social workers, and 4 public members. The 2 main functions of the BSRB are licensing and also investigation of complaints and discipline. Every full board meeting, we try to update the board on the number of permanent licenses under the board. And I'm happy to report we did this total about a month ago. So we are over 16,000 permanent licensees now, and each one of these 16 different categories represents a permanent level of licensure under the BSRB. The largest group of licensees that we oversee is the social work profession. They make up about 55% of our licensees. And then second is probably professional counselors with about maybe 2,500 licensees. In terms of investigation and discipline, as a public protection agency, the BSRB investigates complaints against practitioners under the authority of the board. The agency has administrative authority over practitioners, but this process does not take the place of criminal or civil proceedings. In fiscal year 2024, which we just ended in June, the BSRB received 162 complaints or reports of alleged violation against practitioners, which was about 38 less than the previous fiscal year. In terms of the investigative process, complaints are reviewed to determine whether we as an agency have jurisdiction over the issue, whether the matter involves the potential violations for the profession, and complaints are reviewed by a subset of the board known as the Complaint Review Committee or the CRC. Some of the common violations we see are practicing continuing education without or falsifying continuing education requirements or audit violations when people renew their licenses, practicing without a license or practicing with an expired license, dual relationships, which can include conflicts of interest, making sexual advances towards or engaging in physical intimacy with any client, refusing to report termination or suspension for certain reasons, confidentiality violations, or practice-related issues, such as performing services inconsistent with one's education or accepted professional standards. While our primary role is licensing and investigation, we also focus on outreach. So I and the assistant director and licensing manager speak to groups of students to provide information on licensing and disciplinary matters, to provide a proactive approach to individuals before they become licensed. I also present information sometimes to different associations or groups. I mentioned having spoken to the Center for Excellence earlier this year. I also reach out to the different associations at the state level. And I think during the past year, I did a lunch and learn with the Behavior Analyst Association and also one for the Professional Counseling Association. In addition, I always like to remind everyone about the BSRB YouTube channel. It started small back in January of 2021 as a way for us to have more secure meetings during the pandemic. But since that time, we've now broadcast over 180 meetings that have been either streamed live or uploaded to the YouTube channel, and those have been viewed over 10,000 times. So really proud of that endeavor. It's something we talk about at some of the association meetings and other states. Some of them have modeled what they do based on this as well. On our website, ksbsrb.ks.gov, we include several resources, including a license renewal portal so people can renew their license electronically. We have copies of forms and other application materials, copies of the statutes and regulations, proposed changes to statutes and regulations, complaint and reports of alleged violation forms, disciplinary orders for public discipline, and also information on board and advisory committee meetings. As a state agency, we sort of follow the hierarchy of authority listed here. So primarily, the statutes provide us direction. And when I say statutes, this is language that has been passed in the form of a bill, and it is now law. In terms of the board's authority, that is primarily Kansas Statute Annotated, or KSA 74-7501 through KSA 74-7511. And there are also separate statutes for each one of the professions. There are links on the BSRB website to the Revisor of Statutes website, which actually posts all the language for the statutes. Under the statutes, our secondary authority is regulation. So while the statutes outline the requirements in the law, agencies are able to promulgate regulation language to really flesh out how to implement the law. And so we're able to put forward regulations. And then third is policies. And we can adopt policies by the board or the agency to assist with other operations. Speaking of policies, in your packet of material, I included about 3 different documents that I'm going to reference during the training. The first is the expectations of board members. And I realize most of you are not board members here, but it is really important for you to understand what board members are holding themselves to. So there is language in the advisory committee policy that does say the same policies and procedures that relate to board members should also relate to advisory committee members. So I think there's helpfulness in going through this because it does frame the work of the board, which does frame the work of the advisory committee, but also to kind of know the priorities and virtues the board members are putting forward, so you as advisory committee members can follow those as well. Some of the guiding principles for the agency that the board has agreed upon is that persons in Kansas shall expect that licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional. Persons regulated by the BSRB shall expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulations. The BSRB shall provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost-efficient, courteous, and competent. The BSRB shall be guided and led by ethical principles, clear policies, progressive thinking, and strategic decision-making, and the BSRB shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. In terms of the services by the agency, the BSRB should process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner, take disciplinary action when appropriate, provide timely information to the public, and maintain rules and regulations and statutes. The board wanted to stress integrity, and that board members of the BSRB should have no criminal or professional misconduct record, nor commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. Board members should possess sound moral principles, have courage of conviction to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda of the board, should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside of the boardroom, should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions in those areas of interest, should not represent their personal opinions as that of the board, should be limited to one unexcused absence a year. Specifically involving conflicts of interest, the board wanted to have agreement that these would represent any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business, transaction, or professional activity which is substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board members' duties in the public interest. Board and advisory committee members must make public and recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that exists, which will ensure the integrity of the board and all its decisions. And some of the examples of potential conflicts could be items that would involve personal gain, bias, or effects on personal relationships. Some of the common components of conflicts of interest: a board member of the BSRB should have no personal financial benefit as a result of service to the board, except sustenance and mileage. A board member of the BSRB who may have a conflict of interest according to stated criteria should refrain from voting on the matter. Board members should disclose any relationship with any other agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving such a conflict. Board members serving as part of an organization working in any way with the BSRB should inform the board chair. A board member of the BSRB should not accept any gift or promotional items received as a part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use. And a board member of the BSRB shall not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. And one question I sometimes get during the training, people want to be cautious about conflicts of interest, which is really important. It is understood that given the nature of the profession and given your level of interest in wanting to protect the public and be active in terms of service, that it is common for members of the board or advisory committee members to be involved with other associations or other groups which may have interests that are slightly different than the BSRB. That doesn't mean that you always need to disclose your membership in those groups. What really this is getting at, the core principle is, if you have a conflict of interest based on your membership in one of those groups, and you believe that your membership in another group or your position there may not allow you to appropriately wear your hat in this forum as a member of the advisory committee or a member of the board, and that would conflict with your ability to vote in the way that would be of service to the board of the BSRB, we would ask that you recuse yourself from that vote. But determining conflicts of interest is generally left up to the board members or advisory committee members to make that decision for themselves. In terms of personal conflicts, those are actions that may ultimately have a personal consequence that has a direct or indirect effect on a decision or action, and no decision should be made that will advance the personal benefits of a board or advisory committee member. Concerning confidentiality, individuals serving in this capacity should protect information, and that information must remain confidential during and after board membership. Board discussions involving any of the following matters shall remain confidential unless the board expressly agrees to the contrary. Any discussion that occurs during executive session or any discussion concerning actual or potential litigation. Examples of times when confidential information could be discussed is during the executive session, during those open meetings, or deliberations after a hearing. Now, deliberations after a hearing are generally going to relate more to board members than advisory committee members. Generally, those individuals serve on hearing panels when individuals maybe have been denied for licensure and have requested an appeal. What may impact you as advisory committee members would have to do with the executive session. And those are going to be rare. But if we ever do need to go into an executive session, there is a particular motion that has to be made. It's recorded in the minutes. There is a statute that outlines the specific reasons that we could go into executive session. And then we will make it very clear if that ever comes up. So it will probably not come up very often on the advisory committee, but we'll make you aware of that. And then within that executive session, the information that is discussed should remain confidential. The expectations of board members document talks about the authority. The board chair shall preside at all meetings, appoint members to the advisory committees, appoint members of the CRC, and other ad hoc committees. The vice chair shall discharge the duties of the chair in his or her absence, disability, resignation, or death. The document also talks about the board executive director relationship. In terms of the organizational structure, the executive director will communicate any personnel matters that should be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. The chair of the board will present these board-related issues to the board, and the executive director will communicate to the staff the board's wishes, intentions, policies, etc. And one way I accomplish that is having staff meetings here at the BSRB. In terms of executive expectations, the executive director shall keep the board advised of BSRB activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. The executive director shall prepare the agenda for the board meetings in consultation with the board chair, and the executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for an annual board retreat, which shall allow for issues before the board that require in-depth consideration. What we used to call the board retreat, we now call the off-site planning meeting for the board. In terms of delegation to the executive director shall be the administrative head of the organization, serving under the board at all times. The executive director should be responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board. The executive director shall recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board and have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. So while I do have the authority to hire and fire staff members, if I do want to hire someone, we need to have an open position authorized by the legislature, and the salary that I would put forward for that person would still need to be approved by the Department of Administration, and the governor would actually have veto power in terms of me being able to hire that person and being able to pay them the proposed salary. So there are some checks in place under the law. Concerning monitoring of the executive director's performance, the board shall, when necessary, utilize executive session to discuss issues concerning the executive director. The board shall formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereafter, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained, which I think is a really good policy. It's always helpful to get feedback and learn in terms of performance. We have a performance review with each of our staff members on an annual basis, and we think that's a really good process to repeat here in the office. Moving next to the advisory committee policy. It's a little over one-page document that you were provided. It's also posted on the BSRB website under resources. The advisory committee's purpose is to support the board in carrying out its mission to protect the public. The process by which the advisory committee does that is addressing the issues referred to them by the board, but advisory committees may also suggest issues that the committee believes the board should consider by referring them through the chair of the advisory committee. Once an issue is referred to the board has three options. One, address the issue at the board level. Two, refer the issue back to the advisory committee for additional information. Or three, not take any action on the issue. The document also talks about the structure of the advisory committees. The chair of the advisory committee is a board member. A public board member will also be a member of the advisory committee. And then the remaining members, there will be a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 additional advisory committee members. Most of those individuals tend to be licensees in that area. The executive director is a non-voting ex officio member. The executive director or licensing manager is encouraged to attend advisory committee meetings, and legal counsel representing the board should attend meetings when their attendance is requested. Terms of the advisory committees are 2 years, and advisory committee members may be reappointed by the board chair and can serve up to 8 terms. Now that's something new. Basically, the previous language said advisory committee members can serve up to 4 terms, but there was interest in people who previously served wanting to come back and serve again on an advisory committee. The board discussed this and decided as long as there was a gap in service of at least 2 years, individuals were eligible to reapply to serve on an advisory committee. And if they did, if they were reappointed, they could serve an additional 4 terms. So now you can serve a total of 16 years on the advisory committee as long as there is at least a 2-year gap in between your 4th and 5th term. It is recommended in the policy that appointments to the advisory committee are staggered to avoid too many members reaching their maximum length of service at the same time. And in that language I talked about earlier, the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will apply also to the advisory committee members. In terms of selection of members, nominations can be made by the public, committee members, members of the professional organization, or through self-nomination. Committees should ensure diverse representation, including geographic setting, gender, culture, ethnicity, and licensing levels. Members should represent both public and private sectors, as well as educators in the discipline. The committees reviews nominations, resumes, letters of interest, and their alignment with the board's mission and goals. And the committee chair submits recommendations to the BSRB board for approval. Once appointed, the executive director informs the new member and may provide orientation to familiarize them with the board and the committee's roles and functions. And before we wrap up the training tonight, I'll just touch upon the last handout in your packet. That is guidelines for attendees of meetings. So when we started broadcasting the board meetings on the YouTube channel, we started getting a lot more members of the public and licensees sending us questions, which is great. We've enjoyed that dialogue. We know that 10,000 total of viewers shows that people are really tracking the work of the board, and that's wonderful. But there were some individuals who wanted to provide public comment that maybe wasn't the most germane for the board meetings or the advisory committee. So we created an official policy posted on the board's website. Basically, the policy talks about public comment and that it's not entitled to individuals, but it may be approved at the discretion of the board chair or board or advisory committee chairs. It also outlines the process that should be followed, whether the meetings are taking place in person or remote. And then it talks about the topics relevant for public comment. And so that document has been helpful as a resource, especially when we have guest attendees. So we're about halfway through the training. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. At the next meeting, we can talk a little bit more about some of the legal requirements for state agency committees and subcommittees. But one thing I'll just touch upon before I end the training today, one important thing for you to take away, we follow the Kansas Open Meetings Act. And I mentioned that at the beginning of the meeting. It's one of the reasons why we can't have email communications back and forth between all of us outside of meetings. There are 3 factors we need to watch for. So if you have a majority of members of a committee that are having interactive communication on topics relevant to the work of the committee, that needs to happen in an open meeting. So we can't all be on a phone call unless that phone call is being broadcast or it's open to other people in the public. So we're always kind of watching out for these things. There's other things too, as far as providing notice for meetings and other requirements we'll talk about at the next meeting. But sometimes people go through the training and then they're a little worried, am I prohibited from reaching out to the chair or the executive director? You're always able to do that. The only times you really need to be mindful is don't hit reply all on email. If you receive information, we can always send you information in advance of the meetings for you to review so you're ready for the meeting. But just make sure you don't have that interactive back and forth communication with the majority of members of the committee related to the work of the committee outside of a public meeting. So with that, I will end this part of the presentation and see if there's any brief questions.
Well, seeing none, we will resume the training at our next advisory committee meeting, and that is February the 11th, 2025 at 6 p.m. Anyone have any questions about anything that we've discussed today? Well, I just want to wish all of you a very happy holiday season and have a very good new year. And I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
I think that suffices. So again, everybody have a happy holiday season, happy new year. We'll see you again in 2025.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.